What is the world's deadliest of sins? It's not an easy answer to this question. It's already a bit of a stretch to ask anyway, what is the world's deadliest anything? And I was reminded of a Monty Python British comedy skit. It was called The World's Deadliest Joke, and the skit plays out that there was this man in the 1940s. He was a comedian and he was in his room and he was trying to come up with the world's funniest joke. And when he finished writing, he looked at the joke and then he read the joke, and it was so funny that it was deadly that he laughed so hard reading it that he fell to his death. And those who came to investigate the man's death, the police came over, they picked up the joke. They also broke out into hysterics, and they too also died. And the skit plays out that the deadly joke was so potent that it was eventually taken up by the British military experts, and it became the hilarious secret weapon, and it was a way to end the war. And a truce was made such that the joke would forever be buried after the war for the safety of the human race. So, it's a funny skit if you ever have time to watch it, but to make a rather forced and unnatural segue, we're thinking about the theme of deadliness, something that is deadly to oneself, and what does a deadly joke have to do with deadly sin? So, when we think about deadly and the deadliest of sins, unequivocally proclaimed by literally every saint and every mystic and every spiritual writer, and especially within the Gospels themselves, is the deadly of sins is the sin of pride. The early 20th century writer G.K. Chesterton, he said that if I had only one sermon to preach, it would be a sermon against pride. Now, why does he say that? Now, of course, we have much more central and important teachings and homilies to give with regards to our faith about God and Jesus Christ and all the things within the church and the sacraments and all those things. But when it comes to actually living out the Christian life and the practical living it out in one's faith, what fruit does any of those things bring if one's soul is filled with pride? Now, for saints like Thomas Aquinas, Gregory the Great, and others, pride is not even considered one of the 7 deadly sins, because pride hovers over and above every sin. It is the source and mother of all sin itself. It is the deepest and the most spiritual, most important struggle in the spiritual life. We think about it, in what sense is it deadly though? In what sense? What is it, in fact, that actually dies? Really, you could say that what dies, in fact, is God himself. What dies is the very life of God in one's soul, because one has killed him and enthroned and made oneself in place of God. Pride ultimately declares that God is dead in me. And thus pride can be defined, or has been defined, as a disordered love of my own self-excellence to the exclusion of a proper recognition of God's glory and the excellence of my neighbor. It is to enthrone one's will, casting God aside as irrelevant or non-existent. Now, of course, there is a wrongful pride and a right kind of pride. If there is an element of pride that's good. It's always good to take pride in one's children when they do well at school. It's good to take pride in your own work and to delight in a job well done, and also receiving and enjoying the recognition from others in a job well done. But at the same time, the nature with pride is that it can easily lead to harm, it can be harmful if it becomes or means heightening one's sense of self-importance. In other words, the danger with pride, it transforms self-esteem into an inflated self-importance. And it leads us with that disposition to start looking down upon others, to despise others. It leads us to think that our good comes totally and exclusively from ourselves and our own merits. So it is pride to say, I don't need God. Pride blinds us to our own sin. Pride deafens that interior yearning for God's life and love in one's soul. So it is pride, of course, was the reason for the fall of both man and of the angels. And it is pride that leads to all the other deadly sins, and all sin, because take, for example, the cardinal sin of vanity or vainglory. I'm sure some of you know the Greek mythology of the story of Narcissus. He was known as a beautiful young man, but he never loved anybody. But it was until this moment where he looked into a pool of water and he saw his own reflection in the pool of water. And then he started to fall in love. Who did he fall in love with? He fell in love with himself. He started to look at his own beauty, and he became so obsessed with his own self-reflection that he eventually drowned and died in that moment, being obsessed with himself. And of course, this character of Narcissus becomes the origin of the term narcissism, that where we have that condition of that extreme sense of self-importance that makes a person really ignore the needs of those around them. The gospel says today, for anyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but anyone who humbles himself will be exalted. So the gospel is calling us today to cultivate a virtue of humility, the virtue that is opposite to pride. So if pride tempts us to have an disordered understanding of our own self-excellence, humility leads us to an understanding of who we truly are in the light of Christ and under the cross of Christ. That's why one of the definitions of humility is that humility is simply knowing the truth. Humility, above all, is truth. Some of the saints who quoted, I can quote a few saints on this. St. Vincent de Paul says, the reason why God is such a great lover of humility is that he is a great lover of truth. Humility is in fact truth, while pride is nothing but lying. Saint Mother Teresa of Calcutta said, if you are humble, nothing will touch you, neither praise nor disgrace, because you know what you truly are. And lastly, St. Augustine said, if you ask me what the essential thing in religion and the discipline of Jesus Christ is, I shall reply in three things. First, humility. Second, humility. And third, humility. See, the danger with pride, even especially among practicing Catholics, is that pride can be insidious. It invades all levels and all journeys of faith, because one could even be proud of their own humility, and one could be even proud of their own sense of holiness and righteousness. That's why no one can escape the temptation of pride. It lurks behind every corner, no matter where you are in your own personal journey. The humility mirrored by Jesus himself is, in the words of C.S. Lewis, we can say that humility is not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. Humility is not thinking less of yourself, it is thinking of yourself less. And why do we think, why is that the case? Because one spiritual author put it this way, is that humility is a consequence of love, for it is to cease to attach importance to oneself because one so loves and admires another. It's the consequence of love because authentic love draws us out of our own self-enclosure and self-centeredness. And that is why pride, you could say, is often the result of the lack of love. The proud exalt their own self-importance because they find difficult in themselves to see in themselves that which is important from the eyes of others. Hence the cry for attention and recognition, a la things like social media. It's why ultimately, when we think about come back to the mystery of love itself, that's why we need love and we need to be loved. And that's why we need to first and foremost pray for humility and come to that close encounter with God, who is love, whom loved us first, as I preached about in last week's homily. So the remedy to pride is humility, and the way to gain humility is through prayer. Humility ultimately reflects a dependence on God, whereas pride reflects an independence of Him. The humble soul is always the grateful soul, and the struggle will ultimately end once gratitude begins. Amen.